Daniel Gitterman, what do you teach here at the University of North Carolina?
I teach a large introductory course called Making American Public Policy, largely freshmen and sophomores, but there's 275 of them. And we give them a broad overview of making public policy at the federal level.
As in, how is a bill made?
We do a little of that. We do some budget, we do taxes, we do spending, and then we look at a number of substantive areas sort of up close and in focus: environment, national security, health, social safety net.
You have written a book as well called Boosting Paychecks, The Politics of Supporting America's Working Poor, published by Brookings.
Right.
Professor, in here you talk about the federal income tax as a tool. How is it used?
So I think there's two tools I talk about in the book, the federal income tax and the minimum wage, but let me start with the federal income tax, is that there's different ways to boost the take-home pay of America's workers. One is through federal minimum wage, which is pre-tax income, and we're having a debate about that right now with Obama suggesting we go up to $10.10 an hour. He has now sort of passed an executive order which requires all businesses that contract with the federal government to pay $10.10, but it'll have to go through Congress if we get an increase to $10.10. And on the minimum wage, there's a number of provisions that allow people some tax relief, and the two that I talk most about in the book are the Earned Income Tax Credit, which does the most for the working poor, and also the Child Tax Credit, which actually extends well beyond to middle-income Americans as well. But the focus is on tools that reward and support work.
So when you go back in the history of the federal income tax, what was its original purpose?
The original purpose was to raise revenue for all the government's
for a myriad
of activities.
Okay.
And clearly we saw big increases during world wars to help finance our operation overseas. But throughout you see provisions that shield or give some rebate to workers. And when it comes to families, the Earned Income Tax Credit with origins in the 1970s is clearly the one that gets the most attention.
Who came up with that idea?
It was a small provision in a House bill. A senator named Huey Long had it in a Senate bill. There were two different versions of the Senate bill on how to reward work in some way, and it started as a very, very small provision called the EIC, the Earned Income Credit. I believe it was about 1974, 1975.
What's been the effect of the EITC today? Or over the years?
Well, you saw a number of expansions. You saw an expansion during the Reagan years. You saw the biggest expansion during the Clinton years. And many will claim that the Earned Income Tax Credit is the best poverty rejection mechanism for children. We've seen dramatic decreases in child poverty. The maximum credit is available to those families just near or below the poverty line. So if you think about a minimum wage worker who's making now $7.25 an hour, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, that yields about an income of $15,000. And so if you attach a maximum tax credit, a rebate, a refundable tax credit to that family, you can get that family of 3 or 4 above the federal poverty line. And that's its real power. It also, over the years, has had significant bipartisan support because it's not viewed as welfare or cash assistance. It's viewed as something that rewards and supports work.
How many people in the U.S. do not pay federal income tax because of the EITC or other provisions?
The numbers are large and contentious. I mean, I think Brookings and Urban Tax Policy, I think, has given estimates almost to a third. You know, there are some that pay very small federal income taxes. Some will pay 0 federal income taxes, and the contentious part of the Earned Income Tax Credit is when people get refunds below 0. And so they're essentially getting a cash payment, a refund that puts their tax liability below 0. Republicans say that's backdoor welfare. Democrats say it's the only way to boost the paychecks of working poor families above the poverty line. The non-refundable part of it isn't contentious. The refundable part, where you give people rebates beyond zero tax liability. That's where the tough politics comes in.
When were the first minimum wage laws created, Professor Gitterman?
The first minimum wage was passed in 1938, initiated by FDR. Part of the effort was to deal with some of the wage disparities between the North and the South where we are. He had put forth a minimum wage that was going to be 80 cents an hour. Southern Democrats looked at some of their industries, lumber, textile, and sort of what the average wage was, and it was about 22 cents an hour. So it would have had a dramatic impact on Southern industry. And through the usual congressional process, there were a variety of amendments and deals made, and they agreed to 25 cents an hour. So it was far below what Roosevelt's original proposal was. Roosevelt had also asked that they delegate authority to a wage-setting board, something like the NLRB, but it was called the Fair Labor Standards Board for low-wage workers, and that would set wages across the country. And Congress at that time, with a strong conservative coalition of Southern Democrats and Midwest Republicans, were not all that excited about the idea of delegating authority to a wage board. And so they decided to keep control over wage setting themselves. And so from that point on in 1938, it assured that it was going to be a traditional congressional presidential fight over any minimum wage increase over time. And essentially what we've seen is that if Congress doesn't act and the minimum wage stays where it is at its nominal rate, that the rest of the world is seeing cost of living increases or adjustments if they're lucky, but the value erodes if you don't. And the other thing we've seen is that every effort to index the minimum wage to inflation has also been defeated.
Why?
I think there has always been a strong small business and other lobby of firms that would be affected, and also concerns about inflationary pressures, that it's not something that would happen automatically. It was something that Congress and the President could revisit with new data and evidence on the state of the economy. But we continue to fight about it every few years.
So since 1938, how often has the minimum wage been increased? Has it been about every 10 years, 5 years?
I think we saw the increase after 38 was 49, so it was a long wait. We saw another one in 55 where Eisenhower, first Republican in the White House to sign on to an increase. You saw big expansions during the 60s under Kennedy and Johnson. Nixon reluctantly signed on to a minimum wage increase in the 70s. Ronald Reagan was the only president to never sign, since the New Deal, to not sign an increase in the minimum wage, and you saw its value erode. George Bush Sr. Signed an increase. Clinton cut a deal actually with House Republicans, which was instructive. We've seen Republican presidents sign on to an increase. We hadn't seen a Republican House sign on to an increase, and the minimum wage used to go through a committee called Education and Labor Standards. House Republicans cut a deal that they would attach a minimum wage provision in House Ways and Means to a tax bill. So in exchange for a minimum wage increase in the 90s, Clinton and Democrats had to sign on to significant tax relief for small business. It became a new sort of distributive bargain. And George Bush actually signed an increase to the minimum wage, the latest one that's still in effect in 2007. And Democrats attached the minimum wage increase to an Afghan-Iraq spending bill. So in order to get authorization for military activities abroad, he had to accept the minimum wage increase. You see Obama now with a 10-10. If Obama does not get an increase during his remaining 3 years in office, he will be the first Democrat since the New Deal to not sign a minimum wage increase for workers.
And currently minimum wage $7.25.
25 an hour.
Up to 10.10. That's quite an increase, isn't it? Is that one of the larger increases over in the history?
You know, it's hard to tell because part of the gauge on the increase is how many years have gone by since the last increase to gauge the magnitude. It has been at $7.25 since 2009. What you will see historically is they never do one big